Today we'll be talking about the presidency of George W. Bush, essentially the 2000s in U.S. history. So it starts with the election of 2000. This was a very contentious, very controversial, very close election between George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas and the son of former President Bush. And it was between him and Vice President Al Gore, Clinton's VP. And because of the Electoral College, this came down to votes in Florida, which had 25 electoral votes. And essentially, after the other 49 states were counted, each did not have enough to get the 270 needed to win the election. So that means that whoever wins Florida wins the entire election. Now, it was extremely close in Florida. And when the results came in, Bush was declared to be the winner, and therefore the winner of the presidency. Gore then requested a recount, which occurred over 2 weeks, and it concluded that Bush had in fact defeated Gore in Florida by just 537 votes, and therefore he won the presidency. Gore then contested these results and demanded a second recount, at which point Bush took him to the Supreme Court and said, we can't keep having recount after recount. It's been a month since the election already, and the people need to know who the president is. And so the Supreme Court did rule to stop the second recount on December 12th and officially declared George W. Bush the winner after more than a month of us not knowing who the next president was going to be. George W. Bush had been governor of Texas, and he called his political philosophy compassionate conservatism. And this sought to take care of people while at the same time keeping government small. Now, the first controversial issue that Bush had to face as president when he came into office in 2001 was the issue of embryonic stem cell research. And this is the scientific process of using cells from human embryos, which are very early stage unborn babies, in order to research diseases, for example, Alzheimer's. Now, this is controversial because in order to extract the stem cells, you have to kill the human embryo. And if one believes that human life begins at conception, then this, like abortion, is considered to be murder. However, those who supported embryonic stem cell research argued that killing the embryos is justified because it could save lives in the long run by leading to the curing of diseases. So Bush had this big decision to make about whether or not to allow this process. And in the end, Bush decided that he would allow stem cell research on embryos who have already died, but he would not allow more embryos to be killed for the purpose of stem cell research. Another big focus of George W. Bush was education. His education initiative was called the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. It was a bipartisan education reform act signed by Bush. And the purpose of No Child Left Behind was to improve student performance and education quality by setting higher standards for teachers and establishing measurable goals for students. Now, the No Child Left Behind Act required every state to develop standards for every subject and every grade. And it also required every state to enact assessments at the end of the year to measure basic skills. And Bush essentially said that we need to hold teachers accountable to make sure they are teaching what they're supposed to teach at the quality that the kids need. Therefore, we're going to have tests at the end of the year to measure how much the kids have learned. So in order to receive federal funding, annual state tests had to be given to all students, and that's where the state testing really started to ramp up. This expanded the federal government's role in education, and it was later replaced in 2009 by President Obama with his initiative called Common Core. Now, similar to No Child Left Behind, Common Core also required standards and increased testing, but this nationalized the education standards to where every state had the same standards instead of every state getting to determine their own standards. To this day, in 2024, Common Core is still used in all elementary schools that receive federal funding. So Bush believed that his presidency would be defined by education reform. That is the issue he cared about the most. But about 8 months after taking office, something happened that changed the entire course of his presidency and really the entire course of U.S. history. So on September 11th, 2001, 4 airplanes were hijacked by al-Qaeda terrorists. Two of the planes were then flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. They were two of the tallest buildings in the world and really the center of the economy of the free world. This killed thousands of people and caused the skyscrapers to collapse within about an hour. One plane was then flown into the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C., and one plane was headed either for the White House or the Capitol, but the passengers fought the hijackers, which then brought the plane down in an empty field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 American civilians were killed in this act of war. This was the worst terrorist attack in all of U.S. history, and when this happened, the emotions of the hundreds of millions of people in America and really throughout the free world, emotions ranged from sadness to fear to anger. And President Bush insisted on addressing the American people that night from the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. His aides, Secret Service said, no, it's not safe for you to be there, but he wanted to do this as a sign of strength to the terrorists and to our enemies abroad. He then gave a comforting, very compassionate, and quite inspiring 5-minute address in which he quoted from Psalm 23. He said, we should be comforted by the words spoken through the ages in Psalm 23, that though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And he promised that justice will be served. 3 days later, he visited Ground Zero, which is the place that the towers fell in New York, and he gave an encouraging speech to first responders and promised that the attackers will hear from America soon. Now, because of his previous anti-American terrorist actions and his many threats to America, U.S. intelligence knew that Osama bin Laden was behind this, the leader of al-Qaeda. And because of that, bin Laden immediately became public enemy number one, and the hunt for bin Laden to bring him to justice became the top priority for the U.S. intelligence community. Immediately, President Bush demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden. So the Taliban is the radical Islamic group that controlled the government of Afghanistan, and we knew that bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban. So while al-Qaeda and the Taliban are different, al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization and the Taliban was an extremist, oppressive Islamic government in Afghanistan, they were both allies because they were both anti-American radical Islamic groups and had similar goals. So we demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden. Bush essentially said, our fight is not with the Taliban, it's with al-Qaeda. So if the Taliban hand over bin Laden and expel all members of al-Qaeda from their country, then they won't have an issue with us. And the Taliban refused. They refused to hand over bin Laden or to expel any members of al-Qaeda from their country. And because of that, America invaded. So the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom and invaded Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001. This invasion of Afghanistan started America's war on terror. And there were several goals that the U.S. had when we first invaded Afghanistan. Number one was to find and kill Osama bin Laden. Second was to overthrow the Taliban, establish a new, freer government in Afghanistan for the good of the people there and for the security of the world. And we also wanted to destroy al-Qaeda. And then finally, a big goal of fighting the war on terror in the Middle East was to make sure that the fighting didn't come to our shores again. Was to secure the safety of Americans and other innocent people by preventing future terrorist attacks from happening. Now, President Bush's cabinet was filled with very high-profile, very experienced, and yet very polarizing figures. For example, Vice President Dick Cheney, he was very active, one of the most active vice presidents in history. He was especially active in measures of energy in foreign policy. This led some critics to call him a shadow president. Some said that, he's really controlling Bush, he's making the real decisions. He was definitely a hawk, someone who believed in an aggressive foreign policy, and he advocated for military action as well as enhanced interrogation of terrorists, which was the term used to describe inflicting pain, somewhat called torture, in order to get information from terrorists. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, he was very similar to Cheney, and he was a very early advocate of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which we'll get to in a minute. Then you had Colin Powell. He had served as the National Security Advisor under Reagan and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Bush the Elder. And now under Bush the Younger, he served as Secretary of State from 2001 to 2005. And he was the first African American to serve in all of those positions. He was also a Vietnam veteran. He was a 4-star general and a 2-time recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He also had Condoleezza Rice. She served as National Security Advisor during Bush's first term and served as Secretary of State in Bush's second term, the first black female to hold each of those positions. And she was an expert on counterterrorism and played a very vital role in keeping the U.S. safe in the decade following 9/11. Now, they all received continual praise and scrutiny as they made very difficult decisions in a very public way during the controversial War on Terror. So the hunt for bin Laden had started back in the 90s when he was carrying out terrorist attacks in Africa and the Middle East, and even the one on U.S. soil in 1993. But after 9/11, the hunt for him became the number one priority of the U.S. intelligence community and military. Now, the U.S. came very close to killing him once in Tora Bora, just a couple months after we invaded Afghanistan. Tora Bora is the mountainous region on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, but he did evade our grasp. The U.S. did capture many members of al-Qaeda, but was unable to find bin Laden during George W. Bush's presidency. So bin Laden remained hidden for nearly 10 years after 9/11, mostly in the mountains on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, finally, after nearly 10 years, in May of 2011, SEAL Team 6, ordered by President Obama, killed Osama bin Laden. They then dumped his body in the ocean so that his followers would not create a shrine at his grave. And this long-awaited victory was really celebrated all across the free world. Al-Qaeda has been weak and very inactive ever since, and this is seen as Obama's greatest achievement. So the war in Afghanistan continued for a very long time, and a couple years after the invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. chose to also invade Iraq, so essentially fighting a two-front war for the rest of the decade. And the reason why the U.S. invaded Iraq was due to the actions of the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Well, who is he? He was the dictator of Iraq from 1979 to 2003. Now, a few of his atrocities are included in this slide, but this is not an exhaustive list. For example, in 1980, he invaded Iran, starting the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted for 8 years and resulted in nearly 1 million deaths. He also used weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, against Iranians in this war. He then committed genocide against his own people, both the Kurds in northern Iraq and the Marsh Arabs in southern Iraq. He then invaded Kuwait in 1990, which started the Persian Gulf War, which we talked about before. And then after 9/11, Hussein was suspected of supporting al-Qaeda and continuing to possess WMDs. And especially in the post-9/11 world, where we are very afraid of terrorist attacks from extremist people from the Middle East, we began to see Saddam Hussein as very much a threat. So as a result of Hussein's prior actions and America's suspicions, the U.S. invaded Iraq in March of 2003. This was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. The goals of this invasion were to topple Saddam Hussein's government, replace it with a republic, a free nation for the people there. Our goals were to find potential weapons of mass destruction so that they were no longer in the hands of someone dangerous like Hussein, and to fight the al-Qaeda forces and other radicals who may be hiding in Iraq. So this meant that for the rest of the 2000s, the U.S. was fighting a two-front war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the reaction to this invasion was overwhelmingly positive in America, but more negative in other countries in the world. For example, about 84% of Americans supported the invasion at the beginning, but most other countries did not support this invasion. They said this was not a war that we should be fighting. One exception to this was Britain. Britain was very supportive of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and in fact, the British fought alongside American troops throughout Operation Iraqi Freedom. The Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, was a big supporter of the War on Terror and very close allies with George W. Bush, and because of this, American and British forces fought together in the Iraq War. So after the U.S. invaded Iraq in March of 2003, Saddam Hussein ran. He went into hiding while his army attempted to fight off the Americans. He was then found about 9 months later in December of 2003, hiding in a hole in the ground near a farmhouse near the town of Tikrit, his hometown. So he was found by American soldiers. There you see a picture of him being dug out of the hole in the ground that he had been hiding in. There you see a picture of him after he was taken prisoner, and then just to make sure it was him, we shaved him, and we're like, oh yeah, that's definitely Saddam Hussein. He was then interrogated. He was put on trial at a U.S. Army base for all of his many atrocities and other crimes, and in December 2006, he was executed via hanging. The response of most Iraqi citizens when U.S. forces entered Baghdad victorious and toppled the government of Saddam Hussein was joy. Most Iraqi citizens took to the streets in joy and thanksgiving that their tyrant was gone. You even have Iraqis tearing down statues of Hussein and greeting the American troops with tearful gratitude for freeing them from their oppressive dictator. Bush then declared that the U.S. had removed an ally of al-Qaeda. However, one thing that was unexpected and led to the detriment of the American goals in Iraq was the fact that some Iraqis very much liked Saddam Hussein. While that was not the majority, it was still a sizable minority. So Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim, and most of Iraq was Shia Islam. Now, Saddam Hussein oppressed the Shia majority, but he protected the Sunni minority. So once Saddam Hussein was taken out of power, the Shia majority is very happy that their oppressor is gone, but the Sunni minority see it as their protector being taken away. And so they very much fought against America's occupation of Iraq. So this caused the Iraq War to last a very long time. Throughout the next 8 years in Iraq, the U.S. forces fought against a variety of anti-American Muslim extremist groups that the U.S. collectively called the insurgents. And these groups included members of al-Qaeda and several other groups who either had supported Hussein, who wanted Iraq to be an Islamic state instead of a republic, or who simply did not want the U.S. involved in the affairs of Iraq. Hussein had oppressed every Iraqi group except the Sunni minority, and so after Hussein was removed, Sunni Muslims felt that they needed to fight against the U.S., who they considered to be invaders. And as the war went on, while it started out as a very popular invasion, public support for the war started to decline precipitously over the course of the war. So from 2004 to 2011, less and less people supported the Iraq War. You have a lot more protests and people saying we need to leave. And the reasons for this are many. First, the Iraq War lasted a long time. Americans are very generous people, but they're not very patient people. We're not known for our patience. Therefore, we're willing to sacrifice for the good of another nation if that's in our national interest. But at the same time, if it goes on for too long, there's not much tolerance for that. In addition to that, you have thousands of Americans being killed, and Americans started to see that this as an optional war that doesn't need to happen, and Americans should be home instead of being killed in a foreign affair. It also was costing billions of dollars in taxpayer money every year, and Americans weren't seeing any positive results of this invasion. The U.S. had also failed to find any weapons of mass destruction, which was one of the goals from the beginning, and this led many people to see the invasion of Iraq as a mistake. Well, in 2007, with the war not going well, President Bush announced a new plan called the Surge, in which the U.S. troop presence in Iraq was increased by 20,000 soldiers. Now, a lot of people at this time said that this is a mistake. With the war not going well, why would you send 20,000 additional Americans over there to be put into harm's way? But actually, it worked very well, because having more soldiers in Iraq allowed the U.S. to take control of many urban areas that they had been fighting over for years, including Baghdad, which had been held by the insurgents for many years. This effort was led by General David Petraeus, and it resulted in a decrease in fighting and overall deaths by the end of the summer of 2007. So the majority of the deaths in the Iraq War took place during the first half of the war before the surge, but then after the surge, deaths declined dramatically on both sides, worked very well, and many people think it probably should have been employed right at the beginning. So during George W. Bush's presidency, which was 2001 to 2009, the results of the war on terror were partially good and partially bad. So in Iraq and Afghanistan combined, approximately 7,000 U.S. soldiers were killed. Many more were wounded, and many more suffered PTSD, very severe PTSD, after returning home, with many even committing suicide. The war on terror cost the U.S. approximately $3 trillion, which worsened the national debt problem and worsened our economy. However, the war did keep America safe for nearly a full decade, terrorism-free. It also weakened al-Qaeda, eventually led to the death of Osama bin Laden, making the world a safer place. So some other things that were taking place in the 2000s, in addition to the war on terror, would of course be Hurricane Katrina. This was one of the worst natural disasters in American history. In August of 2005, this Category 5 hurricane demolished New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It caused massive flooding, death, and destruction. In total, 1,833 people died, and millions were left homeless afterwards. This led to global discussions regarding a government's role in responding to natural disasters, because after Katrina, a lot of people felt that the government, the federal government, did not do enough to help the suffering people in New Orleans fast enough when they needed it. Large amounts of looting and crime took place in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, making it unsafe for the millions of people who were left homeless by the storm. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, struggled to get enough food and water to the affected areas quickly enough, which prolonged the suffering. It took New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast years to recover from this disaster. Then you have another disaster in the late 2000s, which was the housing market crash. So this goes back, the roots of this goes back to the late 90s. In 1999, President Clinton and his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Andrew Cuomo, who would later become the governor of New York, they created a new incentive to increase home ownership. They stated that while home ownership was at an all-time high, there was a big gap between the percentage of whites who were approved for a mortgage loans and the percentage of minorities who were approved for mortgage loans. If you look at the chart there, in 1998, about 72% of whites owned a home, but only 46% of blacks and 44% of Hispanics. And so there was a disparity there. And so Clinton and Cuomo said, all right, what can we do to decrease this disparity, to lessen this gap? So what they did is they required the largest housing finance companies to buy trillions of dollars in mortgages over the next 10 years in order to provide affordable housing for 28 million low-income families. Now, mortgage lenders were, as a result of this, forced to lower their standards for those who received mortgage loans from them. For example, it tends to be you have to have a good credit score, you have to have some good money down to pay in order to get a home loan. This lowered all those standards to where you didn't have to have a good credit score, you didn't have to have much money down, and they were giving out home loans to many people of all races, really, who ended up not being able to afford those mortgages and couldn't pay them back. So this did lead to an increase in homeownership, but it also meant that more homeowners were not financially able to pay back their home loans. All of this eventually led to the housing market collapsing in 2008. The housing bubble, as it was called, burst, and the housing market, which was a huge portion of the economy, collapsed. This resulted in millions of people losing their homes. Foreclosures went through the roof. Millions of people lost their jobs. And over the next 4 years, the time period called the Great Recession, which was 2008 to 2012, this was the worst that the U.S. economy had been since the Great Depression. There were many people to blame for this crisis, but part of the reason was the fact that lenders were forced to give home loans to people who could not pay them back, and people were kind of set up for failure. George W. Bush, who had been extremely popular in 2001, had become very unpopular by 2008. His approval rating was over 90% after 9/11. People loved him. But then, as a result of the Iraq War and not finding bin Laden and Katrina and the bad economy, he had become very unpopular. The bad economy would remain an issue for years after he left office, for many years of the Obama presidency. So, last slide here, what is George W. Bush's legacy? Well, Bush's economic and foreign policy decisions remain controversial. Some say he made the right decision, others say he was well intentioned but made big mistakes. However, I would say that his most lasting accomplishment is the impact that he had on Africa. Bush was really the first U.S. president to take a genuine interest in the people of sub-Saharan Africa, who had been suffering for a very long time, who were still behind much of the world and living in abject poverty despite all the wealth that was elsewhere in the world. He especially focused on the diseases that were ravaging Africa. So first off, he wanted to tackle the AIDS problem in Africa. Ever since 1981, when AIDS started, you've had millions of people dying, mostly in Africa. So he created PEPFAR, which stands for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and this saved millions of African lives from AIDS. He sent preventative methods to prevent people from getting AIDS. He also sent antiretroviral drugs and other treatment methods for people who had AIDS, and this saved millions of lives. He also had a malaria initiative that also saved millions of African lives, and malaria deaths per year have been cut in half since the year 2000. This is one of these issues in the world that's actually getting better and better. The number of AIDS deaths and the number of malaria deaths have declined dramatically since the 2000s. Sudan also broke into civil war back in 1983, and the civil war, which took place over the course of 20 years, nearly 25 years, killed 2 million people. Sudan also participated in a genocide in Darfur in 2003, in which over 200,000 people were killed by Arab militants called the Janjaweed and the Sudanese government. Bush was the first person to label this a genocide, which is important because when a president labels something a genocide, immediately the world has to take action against it. Bush was also the one who was able to stop the Sudanese civil war with a peace negotiation in 2008. Bush also had a cancer initiative in Africa that saved thousands of lives. So while he was unpopular in America towards the end of his term, he had made a very big and lasting difference for the people of sub-Saharan Africa during his 8 years in office.